Welcome to the last lecture of the course. I am only trying to summarize what we discussed in the 12 weeks in this course. The week 1 had a first lecture where we introduced the decision support system. How is the computer aided decision support system required or related to the present world scenario? The concepts of the decision support systems, some history about it, that is the time historic progression was discussed. Then acceptance of DSS both in industry and academia, that was discussed. Then uses of decision support systems and the components of DSS were discussed in the first lecture itself, where we also gave an introduction to the term EDP, that is electronic data processing. That is when we have an initial form, then what are the main characteristics of this form. Then the lecture 2 was the characteristics and capabilities of decision support system, where different characteristics such as the DSS access data, variety of sources, then less well structured data, and development and evaluation of a model at for a given process, all these were discussed in the lecture 2. Certain characteristics like the overview of the capabilities of the DSS were also discussed. Lecture 3 in the week 1 shed a light on the misconception and some components of DSS. The misconceptions of DSS is sometimes thought as the DSS is only required at the top levels, or DSS is completely independent, or DSS is the only thing that is to be managed by the top tier people or only the IT people only. No, for decision support system the whole organization has to participate. The people have to understand what are the data they are recording, where did that be used, what will be the future implications or uses of this data. So, that was discussed here in the lecture 3. And components of DSS such as the database management system, model based management systems, DBMS, then MBMS, then user interface and knowledge management systems. These were introduced in the lecture 3. Also DSS schematic was also given. In which the internal data storage, that is the internal or external data that is there, how does it communicate with the data management, and finally what is the decision support system schematic. What is a decision process, various steps in it, these were discussed in the lecture 4 of week 1, in which the kinds of the decisions such as independent decisions, sequential interdependent decisions or pooled independent decisions, those were introduced. Then major phases of this, that is the intelligence phase, design phase and choice phase, those were given. So, decision making from the management viewpoint and the resources which are required, then measuring the success, how to develop a model, decision making process for the structured and unstructured problem, all were discussed in the lecture 4, which concluded the week 1. Week 2 started with the overview of database management systems, in which the user interface, database management system, knowledge management systems and model based management systems, which were introduced in the lecture 3 of week 1, were more detailed, and specifically what is DBMS and its subsystems. These were talked about in the lecture 1 of week 2, and collection of the data, what is database, what is data, major functions of the DBMS and the structure of DBMS. These were all taken in the first lecture. The second lecture continued to the MBMS, that is the model based management system, in which the modeling language and model integration and execution, how does this take place, these were discussed. The types of the models could be strategic, tactical, operational, analytical, those are all discussed here. Certain examples were given by Professor Philip, like tactical model could be one that could have a time interval usually less than 1 year. So, what tactics are to be there? Strategic model are something for the long run. So, week 2 lecture 3 talked about the user interface system. In the user interface, the GUI, graphical user interface, then natural language processing, NLP, and its capabilities, these were discussed. GUI design, the dialog for GUI, these were all taken. The week 4 talked about the GUI in more detail, where user interface system for DSS was taken, and the user in control, the consistency, personalization or customization of information, these were all taken. Week 3 started with an introduction to the database. What is database was taken there, and database technology history, characteristic of database approach, and database users, that is the user could be casual, those who are naive, then sophisticated, and standalone. So, what are these kinds of users and what are their behaviors, and accordingly what do we need to design, these are all discussed. The second lecture in the week 2 talked about why do we need really the DBMS, that is the reasons behind using DBMS, in which the question started from why even not to use DBMS, that is the cost is rising, the number of users are rising, the users need the data which has to be stored. So, it started from here and it discussed about the reasons for the database management system, why do we really need it, and an example of a company environment was given in this lecture. Then the concepts and architecture of database system was given in the third lecture of week 3, where data models, the schemas, instances for these were given, the different schemas like diagrammatical display, the component or an object within a schema, then database instances, these were all given. The 3 schema architecture was also given here. One of the most important point that started in the week 3 was entity relationship, the ER relationship, where the database application, the ER model, ER diagram, then data requirements for it, these are all discussed, starting from what is entity, then what are null values and key attributes of the ER models, these were discussed. The last lecture of week 3 talked more about entity relationship, in which ER diagrams were given and various notations of ER diagrams were given. Notations and examples were given. Then for the computer decision service system, because ER diagram was very important, how to relate ER diagram with our database management systems, this was taken in the week 4, where translation of ER to the database was taken as a topic of discussion, in which major definitions of the SQL, that is the structured query language, that started here, and relation database, the cells, rows, tables. So, in SQL what are different components, those were taken. The lecture 2 started with the data normalization. Data normalization is very important, because when we talk about the aggregation of the data, the first normal form, the second normal form, all these things were given. I would say that is first to third normal form, and other normal forms were also discussed. Then more SQL commands were given in this week itself, because SQL queries such as updating something, deleting something or logging out, these were all taken in week 4. And a brief introduction or overview to big data was given in week 4 by Professor Deepu Philip, where the V's or 5 V's, that is volume, velocity, variety, veracity and volatility were discussed. And this was taken further in the next week, where big data analytics team, what are the requirements for them, And why do we really need a team? Because the IT professional or the data scientist only understands generally the coding, the data administrator mostly understands the overall targets, the investor or the funding agency, the one who has to fund, should also understand why the person is funding, what is the final market value that we are going to get. So that is why the team is required. So then life cycle of the data analytics was discussed in this whole week, in which different phases were there, starting from the phase 1 to phase 5. The phase 1 was discovery, phase 2 was the data preparation, phase 3 was the model planning, and phase 4 come as model building, and phase 5 and 6 were the communicating the results and operationalizing. These were taken in the discussion in the week 5. The week 6 further discussed about the big data analytics tools and softwares, because nowadays multiple tools are available where ETLT, which is a combination of ETL and ELT, that is extract, transfer, load plus extract, load, transfer, that led to the extract, transfer, load, transfer. So this was discussed in the week 6, and taking examples of certain big data platforms such as Apache Hadoop, Apache Spark, then RStudio, Teradata, Microsoft HD Insight, Microsoft Azure. These were all taken, all the major players in the big data which are there, these were all discussed in the week 6 itself, and a case study was taken in the week 6 which discussed about the AMC's Global Innovation Network Analysis, EMC GINA, study on the influence of attending the different conferences, international conferences, on the intelligence enhancement of the people or of the organization. This study was taken in the week 6. The week 7 started with an introduction to IIoT. When we talk about the Industry 4.0, the Internet of Things and Industrial Internet of Things were very important to be discussed upon, which were taken in week 7, where introduction to IIoT was given, and how big data analytics is related to the IIoT. Starting from the Internet of Things only, how does the different layers or different phases of the structure of the IIoT, these were taken, starting from the very central computing to the layer where perception is taken, then network, then processing, and final application where smart manufacturing, smart home, smart city, those things are all taken. These were discussed in the first lecture of week 7. Then big data analytics in the Industrial Internet of Things, this was discussed in the second lecture of week 7, where big data analytics, the relations of it to the different parts of the IIoT, that is the sources of data sensors from where it would come, then analytics tools, analytics methods, the needs, the types of analytics, these were taken in week 7, where the whole structure of big data analytics while using in the IIoT environment were discussed. Further, case study was taken for BDA in IIoT on gas pipeline leakage, where different hardware, the software, the communication, the cloud, how are these connected, and what are the sensors which are used, like flow sensors, fiber optic sensors, piezoelectric sensors, those were all taken. Then outcomes such as the condition based monitoring was possible, and it fulfilled the needs of the people. Then condition based monitoring means the plant which is running for last 10 years with the old plants could also be refurbished. These were all taken, that how big data has helped to identify the points of the leakage. These were all taken. A very prominent case study that is on the Rolls-Royce engine, where pay per hour or pay for service, that was taken in the last lecture of week 7, where a win-win scenario for the engine manufacturers or the engine service takers at the airliners, how are these connected, these were also discussed about. The week 8 started with the role of decision support systems in CAD and CAM, that is computer aided design and computer aided manufacturing. So, where the DSS for the CNC programming or the NC programming was introduced. Here her ideas, design analysis and production are able to develop the geometric modeling. These were looked upon. Then what is geometric modeling? Starting from the very base, what kinds of geometric modeling are there, for starting from the wireframe model to surface model to solid modeling, and how an assembly tree is built, which akin to the decision tree for the manufacturing or a physical product. An example of chair was given in an assembly tree, chair or revolving chair. This example was given. Then big data analytics in computer aided design, certain studies such as the VoxNet real-time object recognition, these were taken, and another product data exchange. And what is product data exchange? What is the need of the product data exchange systems? That is the direct and indirect relationship between the systems. When a neutral file is there, that helps us to exchange the data between two systems. That is, the CNC machine has to take decisions where to machine, where the material is, where the negative space is there, where the positive space is to be cut. So all these things helps. So decision support system, that is the G code or M code that is developed for the computer aided manufacturing. How is this taken from the geometric model, that decision support system for a numerical control system or a computer numerical control system, that was looked upon in week 8. Week 9 further discussed about DSS and CAM, in which the GMN code, the part programming and integrating CAD and CAM, the features of part programming, tool path, the types of programming, the language statements, these are all taken. Certain examples of part programming, how is absolute and incremental programming different from each other, and what are the needs of those for different components, this was taken as an example. In the second part of week 9, DSS for additive manufacturing. Additive manufacturing, where layer by layer the components or the material has to be added, starting from the introduction to the different kinds of additive manufacturing processes only. The 3D slicing, the concept of and what are the various steps in it to convert a requirement or a model to a final product. The algorithm for 3D slicing using G code, this was also given in this lecture. Then big data analytics in additive manufacturing, how is it related, how is BDA and AM are related, what are the risk control, finally how does it helps us to control the supply chain ripple effect. Week 10 was taken by Professor Deepu Philippe, where he talked about the web based decision support systems, in which again the DBMS, the KBMS, MBMS and user interface were taken, in which ease of learning, ease of use, which were discussed before, were taken in the usability part. Then for the user interface design, the usability engineering, and why isn't usability engineering being done regularly? The certain reasons were given for that. The benefits of usability engineering were given to the user, to the company, to the designer, and how do we plan for design. This was also introduced in the week 10 lecture 1. And second and third lecture also talked about the problems and usability design process and principles. So majorly this week centered upon the usability, and HTML as a user interface language was only introduced at the end of this week, where HTML as a hypertext markup language, where basic outputs, inputs, formatting, forms, links were only introduced, and these were connected to a PHP program, PHP, which is hypertext preprocessor, that is HTML to PHP. How do we connect? These HTML tags were taken in the week 11, starting from the history from 1994 till date. How has PHP emerged as a long used language? So major uses of PHP and web servers support for it. Now the configuration of Apache plus PHP 5, which is now also coming into account, that was also discussed. So basic PHP script, in which opening a tag, closing a tag, then naming a file in HTML or PHP, how do we do? All the small commands were given in this week. Then MySQL in PHP, that is the backend of the decision support systems, was taken in the last lecture of week 11, where MySQL has a very popular language for open source database systems. How is this important? And MySQL, certain facts that it can be scaled down to support embedded database applications. These were all taken. Then connect of MySQL with PHP. This was given. The example of a connection was also given. In week 12, various forms and PHP were also given. That is the HTML form, which is the data input to PHP, and the PHP processing form. These were taken in week 12, and displaying the results, that is HTML to PHP, to finally display it. These were taken in the second lecture of week 12. Third and fourth lecture on data visualization, where the use of data visualization, its framework, the different kinds of the data visualization tools, that is the kinds of the data, the types of data visualization. Do we need to interact? Do we need to present? Do we need to interact while having the feedback itself? Those were also given within examples here in the data visualization lectures. Then this last lecture is where we are summarizing the course. With this, the course on computer-aided decision support system, where industrial practices using big data analytics, is closing. This would be definitely followed up with a course where the demonstration part would be more focused upon. For instances, this course was only introduction to the theoretical part, where certain practices were given on HTML, PHP, certain tools were given for the CAM, additive manufacturing, and data visualization was introduced. How to actually make use of them? Using different languages, actually typing the PHP code and try to have a visualization using the PHP further. So, this will be taken in the forthcoming courses. I hope this course has given you a good introduction to the decision support systems. What are the needs? Why do we need various structures of different concepts, and why do we need really planned life cycle of big data analytics? Any queries which are there, you can post in the forum. We would be happy to cater all of them. Thank you.